Dear friends, I'd like to offer a few reflections this morning, or try to anyway, on what is actually a bit like trying to speak about the cosmos and everything that's colliding, everything colliding at this moment, and the Dharma. Just a few pointers really to help us, perhaps to help name where we are, some of where we are, as the illusions break, as the spells are dissolved, as the masks fall away, and we see the core operating mechanisms of the systems that we're in, driven by raw violence, fear, weaponization of division, and so on and so forth, which has been with us a long time, morphing through many different iterations, but has the same logic. So to really just reflect a little bit on the logic of what I'm just going to simply call empire, and the logic that emerges from the Dharma informed by nature. One of the earliest translations of Dharma is in fact the order of things through nature, is the translation of nature itself. The Tao, if you like the Tao, which has its own vastly different logic. So in brief, we could say empire, to try and unpack this a bit more. Imperialism, it operates through domination, extraction, and is often propelled through fear and competition with each other. And yet the Buddha pointed to a very different organizing principle and reality, one of interbeing or interdependence or actual dependence on each other. Everything that we are depends on everything else as it is. So this illusion of individuality is one of the big operating logics of empire. And also the Buddha deeply rooted his Dharma in non-harming, and the invitation to serve and be part of the liberation of all beings, regardless, through transforming the poisons of the mind. So the Buddha posited the source of all that emerges through the suffering that's generated. Well, the major suffering that we can actually transform and overcome, the main dukkha. There are different dukkhas that are just inherent in life, what he called dukkha. The dukkha of aging, the dukkha of pain, the dukkha of loss. But the dukkha that he was really pointing to was the dukkha of ignorance, that emerges from ignorance, not understanding, not seeing clearly the nature of what we're in. We make assumptions that are not based in reality. Assumption of being a separate being, for example, an individual. We are in so many ways, but that is not the deeper underlying truth of the Dharma. The assumption of permanence in a world that's everything that we see is conditioned, has come together for a spell of time and will by necessity dissolve and return to its elements. So we live under these illusions that are rooted in the mind itself. So the burning of the world, as he, in his third sutta, teaching that he gave after his liberation, the fire sermon, directly connects the burning of the mind with the forces of greed, hatred, and delusion, and the relationship of that to how that mind then projects and creates the world that we are now in a world burning up with these poisons. So often in the Dharma, the second noble truth really looks at the source of this generation of ignorance through this endless craving, endless seeking, the unilluminated nature of desire. It's not really desire itself, but it unilluminated, not understood, points to the wrong object, and therefore never gets satiated, never gets released from. What I wanted to point to in this talk is that often the way that we practice is very internal to our individual experience, and that's where everything begins, here, within this mind. But what we're called on, I feel, in this time is to also see that empire itself is craving institutionalized. It's actually weaponized it, marketed it. And so we're not humans anymore to the point that we're just consumers. We're objects on this wheel of endless satiation in a world that can never be satiated because enough is never enough. And that's one of the logics of empire, to continually inflame this sense of lack, this sense of need, the sense of the next click, we'll do it somewhere. And at the same time, that impoverishment isn't just inward, it's actually being mechanized into the actual system that we're in. So I mentioned in the send-out of the Chakravarti Sihananda Sutta, the Lion's Roar, Turning Monarch Sutta, where the Buddha is actually advising kings. He didn't eschew political or military power, he tried to advise it and guide it. And he directly points to, in this sutta, that social breakdown, he relates and connects social breakdown and violence, increasing violence, to the fact that that arises from when rulers fail to distribute resources justly, when there's a lack of justice and true equity. Which is what the situation that we are in now, structural injustice, in other words, generates social collapse. So the Buddha wasn't naive about systemic oppression and harm. He didn't just stop at individual liberation from the poisons of the mind. He applied it to the systems in his Sangha, and in building out those systems with guidelines that collectively lessened the practices of harm and held them accountable when they arose. I think this is a very important piece that we miss at this point, when the systemic levels of violence and lack of accountability are creating the conditions for a massive amount of collapse, not only politically and socially, but of course the big one is environmentally, the very systems we rely on for life. So this really has been, I think, something that we at Sacred Mountain Sangha have been deepening our contemplation of, and within this moment, of how do we translate this Dharma, particularly in the ways that it has often been individually orientated, not completely, because there's been a tremendous amount of palliative care offered from that resource of the Dharma in so many amazing and beautiful, important ways of serving and helping people. It's almost like being janitors to the fallout of a capitalist system, trying to mop up the pain, but without really looking at the system, perhaps not in the hegemonic spaces of Dharma so much as those that have lived historically in being marginalized and have experienced systemic oppression in more threatening ways, not just challenging, but deeply threatening. Had to think about so deeply, how does this Dharma relate to actually systems change? How can we bring the Dharma to, at this moment, how does our inner liberation, that process, connect to the outer structures that we live within, and what's the interface? How do we bring not just solidarity, but the the mechanisms and ways that we can help those systems reform, and where they can't reform, as they crash around us, through their last, in a way, through expressing themselves through more extreme levels of violence, which is a symptom of weakness, really. It's a symptom of collapse, not a symptom of strength. How do we then build up from underneath that and create the kinds of collaborative, creative spaces that can withstand and sustain through this time that we're in, which is we're increasingly faced by an urgency, because nature is not on our calendar. It's not like we have a meeting and discuss this and do another conference. Nature's just moving in response, like the Dharma, to the causes and conditions that have been set in place. And there are major trigger points, collapse points that we are already passing that allows us to live in a sustainable world. And some of this is becoming irreversible very quickly. And in some ways, what we're seeing politically, economically, and in the systems that we're within, as they do become, to sort of move towards more collective oppression and violence and a lack of accountability, in a way, this is all somewhat a symptom of the deeper threat to our existence. It's like a sort of break from reality. People living in this illusion, if we can only control it all through our wealth, through our power, then we somehow will survive. The illusion of individuality, of lack of interconnection, everything depends on our ability to be here, depends on a sustainable ecology. So all of this is very impactful for our nervous systems, and the logic of empire in many ways lives and takes up real estate in our nervous system. It has different symptoms, and we can actually, as a meditator, begin to recognize when that's operating, when we're operating, and in many ways we're sort of colluded into that system for our survival, or so we think we are. So there's a certain momentum to the logic of endless growth, endless drivenness, that actually rewires our nervous system, which we can illuminate and become aware of, and then start to interrupt that patterning and replace it with the logic of the Dharma, the logic of nature, the deeper realities of interbeing. So there's a lot of fear that can live in us at this time, because the logic of empire is using authority and power underwritten by threat. And because of that, there's a sense of disempowerment. There's a sense of the power at the top being centralized. And not only that, one of the effects of that is us being isolated from each other, forced sort of manufactured division in all the ways that we know that is being generated. So this sort of sense of control through increased surveillance, of measuring value by constantly being measured in profit, dominance, efficiency, getting there, being driven, the next thing, sense of scarcity, a sort of increasingly narrowing of imagination, narrowing of what is actually allowed for humans, undermining of creativity, a sort of hijacking of that, or we look at entertainment as outside ourselves. So there's a lot in this sort of reclamation that starts in the Dharma practice of just stopping, breathing more fully, feeling where the constriction is, where the pressure is, refusing to go along with the convenience that's offered in our contemporary system, refusing, for example, to get something that can come in 2 days' time rather than sourcing local vendors that maybe take a week. So we're paying a price for this convenience, for this constant sense of speed, this feeling of not being enough, feeling of consumption, and this inevitable sense of community being replaced, connection being replaced, as we're siloed more and more into these individual units, and this sense of it's us to up to us as individuals. The problem is us. If we recycle enough, if we get the sort of right kind of electric vehicle and so on, when really it's not about us so much being able to change the system. We can do what we can, but it's about the whole system itself and how it's driving and where it's being driven from. And I think recently we've just seen these last illusions of where it's been driven from have been stripped away, and seeing how deeply the power protects itself across governments, institutions, cultural authorities, all of which have undermined our constructed legal and moral guardrails, particularly as we're witnessing the inability to hold these crimes against humanity, really profound horrors, to hold them accountable, even as we're seeing them. So really what we're seeing is this system revealing itself and its coding. It's a revelation. We have to see through the illusions that the Buddha taught, the illusions of ignorance, whether inwardly, systemically, collectively. So in that way there's hope, actually. Because to see, to illuminate is a certain kind of power. It gives you choice, whether you go along or whether you withdraw from those codings and operating systems, whether you can see how they're coded inside you, where they take up space inside you, this sense of pressure and having to move from that fear of not enough, not belonging enough. We need to be more, we need to get more. So we're witnessing crisis, but we're also witnessing exposure. And it's frightening people, it's overwhelming, it's horrifying. But on the other side, we're seeing the mask has dropped. And so the question now is, what will we do? How can we respond? As in the Dharma, there are many ways that we can move against this way that the coding of empires, it isolates, fragments, extracts, as it keeps accelerating the pace of everything beyond what the human body can manage. The messaging of you're alone, or to compete, to consume, to comply. This is an imposed artificial order, and so to recalibrate from the Dharma is to recalibrate from the intrinsic order of the Dharma. And the Dharma is very much the expression of nature. Buddha didn't talk empire logic, he taught from a place of ethically based community. That nothing stands alone and no one stands alone. Community rooted in practices that promote discernment, careful relationship, kindness, generosity, accountability. In the same way, the rhizomic logic of nature, a very living system that allows us to be embodied in this earth. It's not central imposed dominance, it's lateral, meaning it moves sideways, it moves into relationship. And we are rhizomic because we are nature at a very deep level. It's a logic that's intuitive to us. And we can actually actively live from that logic. There's no central trunk, no central power, no central defining authority, no single controlling root in the rhizomic, dharmic logic, and no top-down command. It's multiple points of co-emergence, multiple points of intelligence that we can read once we have the eyes to see. Not once we're not depending on an external power that we've become collaborated into to define our reality. It's such a small reality now, increasingly narrow. When we live in this vast cosmology of interdependence, interconnection, it's growth through connection, not hierarchy. It's relational, mutually dependent, actually. It's okay to be dependent. It's like the worst thing ever in our society to be dependent. I've just been with my 96-year-old mum. 96 is a grand age, and is feeling very much the limitations of the body, but there's still such a strong part of her of feeling ashamed of not being able to do what she feels she should do, or not having to depend on. And it's poignant, that's the conditioning, rather than realizing actually the root of community is the fact that we need help from each other. And we should perhaps make ourselves more vulnerable so we can actually seek that help and ask for help and share space and time by being helped and helping. Sharing cars, sharing journeys, sharing meals. So it's a practice, it's a different kind of practice to not be so independent, to reach out, to move beyond this siloed, forced siloing that the primary relationship with the digital world rather than each other. So in the rhizomic, dharmic way of looking, resilience is not being independent, but it comes from diversity of all the different spaces that we can connect with, moving out of these silos that we're placed within and place ourselves within. It comes through connection and relationship. It's adaptive and not extractive. It flows around to find points of life. Value isn't acquisition, but it's in mutual thriving, vitality. And scarcity isn't a fact of life when it's met with sharing. And imagination rewilds when it's allowed to have the space to co-create together from our deepest passions for this moment. And to really see this internal critique and judge that puts us down every time we might move into that space. Imagination rewilds when it remembers possibilities beyond the status quo. Humans are kin together, not competitors. That we're humans, not consumers. To refuse the language, to refuse the categorization, to refuse the activity of being within the logic of empire. That nature isn't here to be controlled and dominated, it's our primal nurturer, our giver of life. It proliferates mostly quietly, regenerates for billions of years, reimagines itself. It teaches us we belong, we collaborate, we share, we adapt. So the beginning, in a way, to move from the logic of what actually is leading us to destruction and death, violence, oppression, where we're being led, is to refuse that logic. Is to step out in any small and larger ways we can. And I think as we're coming up to these very critical, it's not like we're waiting for the future of when things get bad. We're in that. The future has arrived. Here in the US, there's a very important election coming up at the end of the year, which will be extremely significant. How are we already going to prepare? Not that I have brilliant faith in elections or the parties involved, but it is an important marker, and there's much that can happen around that, and much that can actually help us reorientate our thinking very radically to build out a world underneath the collapsing dinosaur. Beginning by really challenging the places in ourselves where we get moved from fear, from lack, from being driven, from grasping. As our practice interrupts that, gives us time to reflect, to breathe more deeply, to evict that real estate of empire in our nervous systems, and replacing that with space, with deeper listening, refusing the burnout culture, to reclaim our attention, to simplify. These are the things, and it's very hard because we're all so sewn into this gig economy. So it takes more effort, it takes each other to really consider, how can we do this together? How can we unhook? How can we simplify? How can we need each other in ways that helps us shift from fear and isolation into courage and empowerment? So we're living at this time, it's not to panic, but to be clear and strategic, what the Buddha called Sangha. It's like a sacred sense of urgency. Sangha is also completely coupled with saddha. Saddha is faith. That these two are what propel us on the path. Sangha is a sense of life is limited in this form. Opportunity to practice. It's not here in this form forever. That's what we were chanting. But also the way we're carrying on life, not just personally, but this sustainable life is amazingly and increasingly and profoundly under threat. It's just completely hard to digest that reality, but it is a reality that we somehow have to manage to respond to. As is all of the hard-won rights over generations for more equity, not perfect by any means. This is something we can't do alone. I think that's very clear. It can start with us in our inner practice. We can't really, the storm is here. We can't really control all of that, but we can, as is, we could say, we can strengthen the village. And the village is local and international and global. So there's a sense of the urgency, the window narrowing, but so is the illusion. The illusion is falling away, what we're in. For many in marginal worlds, that fell away a long time ago. So we have much to learn from those that have been on front lines for centuries, decades. It's an act of humility, going up against these forces of destruction that are so corrupt. But what is for me important is not only, I think, just a couple of last thoughts, and there's so much to say on this. I think there were two things. I was just in Palestine and had the privilege to go the other side of the walls, beyond the modernity walls that of the empire, to those living under the most crushing oppression of empire. We've all witnessed, we've all seen, we all know what we're talking about here. And one of the things that I left with, both it's like the ground zero of apartheid, visible through the most immensely ugly walls, walling in whole communities, dividing them, endless checkpoints and so on, endless threat, fear and violence. We're seeing it more local. We've just been observing that here, Minnesota and so on. I think there's a couple of things in this that I came away with. There are many, many things. One was this power of community, the power of, on the other side of the wall from the siloed, slightly disassociated or profoundly disassociated, soulless often world of modernity, the world of empire, that those haven't been welcomed or allowed into empire, been eternally oppressed, subjected to violence, monitoring, policing. Is the strength of community that it necessitates to thrive, to survive, to flower, to blossom. Coming from a place of needing each other, really needing each other for that. And I think the other piece that was so palpable for me was the absolute courage of the human spirit. And that we dismiss that the human spirit seeks freedom from oppression and always will. And then when that joins together and is aligned with a deep ethic and dedication to a path, a spiritual path of compassion, that is an incredible power. So in a way, although there's a lot to be very overwhelmed by, very fearful of, we can, in response to fear, contemplate fear. And that very movement towards being frightened to contemplating fear is a movement that starts to grow courage. The very moments when we reach out to soften out of our individualism, I'll do it, thank you for offering me a lift, thank you for offering me a meal, thank you for, would you like to come and share this, would you like to? So going out and inviting neighbors for meals, for tea, in this era that we perhaps haven't spoken to, could well be the beginning of a revolutionary act to break this silo, to break these pigeonholes, to break this illusion of separation. So I feel bizarrely and irrationally hopeful. I don't think it's a false hope. I think it's this accompanying samvega with saddha, the faith to heart, the faith to the ingenuity of us as humans, the faith that we've been here before in many different stories and have come through them for the better. Not always. The Buddha himself tried to stop a genocidal army coming for his own people. He tried 3 times, but he couldn't even stop them. So we have to be realistic too. There are great consequences to this use of extreme violence. However, we are not without means or power, especially when we draw together. So this coming year, it's one of our focuses at Sacred Mountain Sangha, emerging from this rhizomic work that we've been exploring and being entered a training to help support us to understand how we can bring the Dharma to this moment, training that came out of the liberation struggles of South America, coupled with some of the early resistance movements here in North America and across the world, based in the logic and the power of understanding of the deep intelligence, the lasting intelligence, the rhizomic intelligence, the dharmic intelligence of both the cosmos as we experience as this light of awareness of consciousness that can reflect and make a choice and choose differently, and also the spirit of nature, which endures. Life endures, adapts, moves, depends on and connects with, moves towards connection, not to separation. And it's the faith in these enduring principles that are deeply embedded within our ancestry, within our remembrances, within our dreams, within our hopes. We just have to remember and reclaim and rekindle and reflect back to each other and move from there more and more to make the logic of empire obsolete within ourselves and within each other. No small task. We make the moves that we can, and my experience is this is a speaking, alive cosmos, world, reality, and that reality responds. It moves. When we move from that faith and open a path, there is a response. As said in the Kuan Yin Dharmas, the response and the way are intertwined inconceivably. The more with this time unfolds that we're in, one of the things I learned from my dear friend that I was staying with and tracking, and wherever she was taking me in Palestine, was she would keep telling me off, keep trying to plan the next day. She said she doesn't do it. Impossible. She just moves from what is needed, and then the plan can change, and it has to change because of all of the conditions we're living within. While we might strategically organize, try also to leave the space for something new to arise. As Nisargadatta says, reality comes in the form of the unexpected, but if we don't allow the space for it, the listening for it, the renunciation that can enable it, the giving up of the logic of expediency, an immediate satiation, then we won't hear that subtler voice and prompt of the spirit. So, dear friends, this is mind-numbing